are there.
And the differences show up on tests that have been largely constructed by white males.
That's true, but Japanese people and Oriental people generally score higher on those same tests than do whites. Furthermore, it doesn't have to be those kinds of tests that we're looking at. If you look at educational performance, if you look at economic performance, if you look at job performance, not just in the United States, but in London, England, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere, the pattern is consistent.
And is it not true that the governor, what is essentially would be our governor of Ontario, has called for your dismissal from...
Oh, he called for me to be dismissed. He phoned up the university president, asked for me to be fired. The university president defended my academic freedom. So the governor of the state, so to speak, put the Ontario Provincial Police onto me. They carried out a 6-month investigation under the Canadian Criminal Code, which investigated me under the hate literature section and under the spreading of incorrect news. And after a 6-month investigation, they concluded that although my ideas were crazy, they were not criminal. But of course, by then the damage had been done, and my reputation was extremely tarnished.
And I assume you do acknowledge receiving funds from the Pioneer Fund.
Oh, I certainly do, yes.
And you deny, I assume, the Pioneer Fund, the allegation that the Pioneer Fund is a neo-Nazi organization.
Of course, complete rubbish.
Barry Mehler, Ph.D., professor of history of science at Ferris State University in Big Rapids, Michigan. Well, you've been here before. Here we are again.
Yes. I saw Phil at the AAAS, the American Association of Science meetings in February. He came, I gave a press conference, and he came to hear me, and I gave a paper. And afterwards, we sat down for a cup of coffee together. And he said, Barry, you made some excellent points. But this neo-Nazi business, I mean, I know these people. You're talking about stand-up guys. And I said, Phil, you're a stand-up guy, and you're a neo-Nazi. and he got back, and he said, I don't understand. You know, he's really surprised, and I know he doesn't understand. The movement that he's a part of begins in the Hitler era. And we have people, he's got a master race and he's got an inferior race. And on average, by the way, this is what all of the scientists in the 30s were talking about too. On average, they believe that, the Germans believe that the Aryans were the master race. The Japanese believe that the Asians were the master race, that they were specifically the master race among the Japanese. So the idea of a master race is an essential element of fascism. And the institutions that Phil belongs to grow right out of that era. The Pioneer Fund is established in 1937. One of the first projects of the Pioneer Fund is to breed better Americans. I have with me the proposal for the first year's Pioneer Fund projects. And what they want to do is choose Air Force cadets and encourage them to high fertility. The idea is that character traits, etc., are all genetic, and if we can encourage the superior to breed, we'll have a better country. Phil Rushton talks about a biosocial solution to social problems, and what he means is that we can't solve social problems environmentally. What we need to do is solve social problems biologically and genetically.
Not unlike breeders of horses win races.
Actually, it's horse breeding, cow breeding, it's human breeding. And in fact, Roger Pearson, who is the editor of the Mankind Quarterly, which is one of the major journals distributing this stuff, I'll tell you a little bit of Roger Pearson's history. He comes to the United States in 1965 after organizing the Northern League in Europe, which brings together not neo-Nazis like Phil, but Nazis. Arthur Ehrhardt, Waffen-SS officer, Hans F.K. Gunther, Hitler's professor of racial ideology. I'm talking about not neo-Nazis, but Nazis. Roger Pearson comes to the United States in 1965 to go to work for Willis Carto, who is described by the Anti-Defamation League as the distributor of, the largest distributor of anti-Semitic literature, racist literature in the United States, editing Western Destiny, which again is called a Nazi-tinged magazine. And after he does this, he publishes a pamphlet, Eugenics and Race.
Let me just share with you. This is number 5, Brian. Here is what Professor Roger Pearson said, among other things, in a book or a pamphlet titled Eugenics and Race. Listen to this. If a nation with a more advanced, more specialized, or in any way superior set of genes mingles with, instead of exterminating, an inferior tribe, then it commits racial suicide and destroys the work of thousands of years of biological evolution. Does that scare you?
He's calling for extermination. Richard Lynn, let's try Richard Lynn now. Richard Lynn is, Phil uses Richard Lynn's research. Richard Lynn is one of the key people originating the Oriental superiority theory. Richard Lynn writes a review in the Journal of the Irish Journal of Psychology in which he says, we have to change our religion. We have to get away with Christianity, which says that the meek shall inherit the earth. We need a biological religion. And in a biological religion, we have to understand that in order to make progress, we have to allow evolution to progress. And evolution is the survival of the fittest. What we're called for here is not genocide, he says, and this is almost a quote. What we're talking here about is phasing out incompetent societies. Now, I ask you, how do you phase out incompetent societies?
I'll bet you're going to say you're foursquare against that kind of politics.
Well, of course, it's absolute nonsense. This is the thing. Dr. Mehler and all my opponents don't have to answer the intellectual argument. All they have to do is start throwing words around like Nazi and racist and fascist, and it's a label they pin on people, and then you don't even attend to what the person says. What he's just been talking about is a load of absolute rubbish. And the question is, and I put it to him, why do, say, black children walk 1 month earlier than white children? Why do white children walk 1 month earlier than Oriental children? Those are interesting research questions. I'm a scientist. I've written 5 books, 100 research articles. I've won various awards. I have no political agenda whatsoever. I'm simply trying to find out why people are the way they are.
But you also permit yourself to make the value judgment.
No, I don't. I don't make any value judgment.
To suggest that Asians are inferior in intelligence to whites and blacks is a value judgment.
You used. I never talk about inferior or superior.
Well, what is your language then? And perhaps I should ask you.
They score higher or lower on various traits. Some things like sociability, for example, blacks are more sociable than white people. White people are more sociable than Orientals.
Sociable measured by what criteria, developed in what culture, and advanced by what researchers?
You raised a very interesting point about the New York Times this morning about these black youths who had beaten up this Oriental person.
A Vietnamese person, yes.
Yes, if you had read the New York Times fully, what it said at the very bottom was one of the black neighbors said, you know, those Orientals were not very friendly. They were rude. They never smiled. Now, what I'm suggesting is that there really are racial differences in temperament that we've got to learn to understand one another by. I don't think that Orientals are.
And sometimes Cadillacs break down. This is an, this is an anecdote you're sharing with us,
Bill,
Doctor.
if we will just, he's saying, if we will just understand that blacks have small brains, large genitals, are inferior in intelligence, are more prone to aggression and criminal behavior, then we'll all get along a lot better.
I'd like to ask you, why even do this research? Don't you know it's going to cause problems? And if you create this perfect society, what are you going to do with it? I mean, what's after that?
My job is to find out why people differ from one another. You know, children, even in the same family, if you have 2 children or siblings, they differ from each other genetically and behaviorally. They're not the same. Well, if you think of how different 2 children in the same family can be, just think how different the human races are likely to be.
Just think of how different individuals within the human community can be. There's nothing controversial about that.
No, and my job for years has been to look at individual differences. But then when I started looking at genetics, I found these big mountains of gene pools called races and ethnic groups within races. And they interested me. And they interest everybody. We've all got theories as to why Orientals are different from blacks and so on, because Orientals are not the same as blacks. We all know that. And I'm suggesting the difference is partly genetic, and the differences lie in evolution.
Would that explain why, on average, the Irish might be different than the Germans?
It might. I haven't looked at Irish and German, so I can't answer.
You haven't.
But I've looked at the 3 major races.
Well, Phil, I can tell you something.
You're suggesting that when you say that blacks score lower on average than whites or Asians, You draw no particular value judgment from this information?
I don't personally. I'm just trying to describe the situation as it is.
But you do share, do you not, with your academic audiences, your belief that the reason for this is genetic?
I believe it's about 50% genetic, yes. That's the best
So
estimate
genes, then, account for the cross-variability of these?
About half of it. The other half is definitely environmental. From all the twin studies that we've been able to look at so far, that's about the best estimate.
Are you there, caller? Hi.
Hi, I would just like to know, what is the purpose of this information? You find out what this information is, and then where do you go from that? Is it just so he can justify his I don't know. I don't understand it.
I'm a scientist, and I'm trying to find out what the causes are. You see, if you say, well, black crime is due to white racism, you're saying that's the explanation. And what I'm saying is that might not be all of the explanation. There might be something inherent in populations that make people behave differently in temperament or intelligence or what have you.
Yeah. Now, we're wondering why we have racism in the world today. Now, taking a look at this gentleman here, we can see that this is one of the prime examples as to why we have racism. Now, let's get back to what he talked about originally, about, you know, blacks being different from Asians, Asians being different from blacks. In my study, I find that every one of us, all human beings, have the same size brain, 16 ounces of brain. None larger than this or larger than the other, unless he's abnormal in some kind of a way. It's environment that breeds everything. To give you a classic example of that, if you take a jar of fleas, and you take those fleas and you turn it upside down with that jar on it, those fleas are going to jump. After a while, you can take that jar from around those fleas, and neither one of them will jump out of that circle. So everything is environmental. You know, this crap he's talking up here is just a bunch of garbage.
You say your study, you are an academician, a researcher, I'm asking.
No, I'm just a self-employed individual.
Okay, well, fine.
But it's true that that there are very prominent anthropologists who have refuted all this data. Now, Phil doesn't do his own research. He picks and chooses among data that he likes. And for example, this business on the head size, it appeared in Science magazine, and 5 researchers from around the world wrote in to say it ain't so. And Christopher Stringer at the British Museum, world eminent anthropologist, said it ain't so. It's not true. He chooses the one that fits his theory, and everybody else who disagrees with him, he ignores.
Well, I should say that I've just collected a whole lot of data from NASA, the space agency, which looked at military samples from Korea, from Japan, and compared them with NATO countries. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Orientals do have larger heads, on average, than whites.
Well,
That's
you know, we'll be here all day arguing the data. So what? You mean a bigger brain means a smarter person?
Slightly so, yes, on average.
And a big and larger genitals mean more promiscuity.
That is something that the media likes to hype up. I've looked
did you say that or didn't you?
Sexual intercourse frequencies. You see, if World Health Organization has looked around the world at how often people have intercourse, even with their husbands. Right now, China has just produced a Chinese Kinsey report. It was written up in Time magazine last week. Oriental populations have less sexual partners than do whites. Whites have fewer sexual partners than do blacks. This has dire consequences. If you look at the worldwide distribution of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis, gonorrhea, and the pandemic that's killing people, AIDS, the racial differences are there. They're there in New York City. They're there in the Caribbean. They're there right around the world. And those are facts.
And his penis-sized data comes from an 1898 anonymous French army surgeon who traveled through Africa and records the size of African penises. And then he's got another study. He's got a study that compares Nigerian medical students to Czech army officers, which shows that the Nigerians have longer penises, the Czech army officers have more circumferent penises. So which is bigger, long or fat?